My slides are ready, so apologies for the last-minute change in the agenda. My name is Mounir Halim, so I'm from Africom. Africom is a young publication company and consulting company. We started in September 2018, and we've been growing fast since then. Also, I'm very, very proud to say that it's the first publication in the business that is not a London company. And more importantly, it's the first Arabic company. So it's based in the Emirates and run by a Moroccan. So this is really, really, we are really proud of this. So thanks to the AFA administration to allow me to speak today. But I chose a subject that is also close to our heart and is of interest to many, many participants in this industry of all the different fertilizers. And it's the African market. And I've chosen particularly to give you a taste or a teaser on what's happening in Africa in terms of the changing dynamics. So today's presentation will not go into any greater details, but will swing from different sides of the continent just to show you the increasingly changing dynamics and the competitivity and many other related items. But I like this. This is not our map, but it's an interesting one of all the rich commodities that Africa has. This is not exhaustive. Obviously, for example, the blue is phosphates, but we know there are phosphates in Algeria, in Egypt, and so on, and also around Africa, in the sub-Saharan side. But it's more to focus on the fact that most of these commodities have been for a while being exported in raw state, which means it's already depriving the African continent from much needed margins. But it will not be the subject of our discussion today. The go swiftly because we'll go through in details. In introduction, we go into the challenge that we have in Africa, or what we see and encounter in Africa today. The changing dynamics, this is actually of what's happening now. And then we'll highlight on some regulatory and policy impact that is affecting the trade, the growth, and in some cases causing even challenges for growth. And hopefully we'll summarize with some valuable takeaways. So, this map here, of different style, and it never fails to amaze me. I've seen it for a few years, and every time I look at it, it just surprises me. This is actually as close as a real presentation of the real size of Africa. And you can put China, India, US, Europe, and still a lot of spaces around. It's colossal, which means is the huge potential of this continent, certainly in agriculture. We hear a lot about Africa as a problem, and we hear it on a daily basis. And I heard it while I was working on the phosphate industry, while I was working on the publication. Africa is an issue, Africa is a problem, there's this, there's this, there's this. But actually, what the focus should be really on is it's actually the solution to all the problems of the world, not focusing on the problems that Africa has today. And that's why I decided to call it Africa is actually the solution. Just look at the fertile land. 50% of the world unused fertile land is in Africa. I mean, that alone speaks very loud. You have the land. You also have abundant workforce. More than 60% of so there's a mistake in the slide. There's more than 60% of the population in Africa is working in agriculture. And not only that, it's also growing. More than plus 25% of the world population in 2050 will be in Africa. So we have the land, we have the resources, and we have the people. So it must be the solution. But the solution to what? It's extremely visible on the right graph what the problem is that we will be facing very, very soon in our lifetime and for the next generations. So you can see in green is the arable land hectare per capita, and you can see how it's been decreasing year by year. And obviously, we are growing as population of the world. And then when these drives started to cross each other, there is a clear need of more food. And that's why food security is a big issue to many entities, public and private. Now, the good news here, this is excellent news for all the fertilizer industry and obviously of this region, because a very clear, with the shrinking of land, there is clearly the option of Africa, and this is what I'm talking about, the solution, but also within Africa and elsewhere, and particularly in Africa, is the yield maximization, and that will only come with the right use of the right fertilizer and obviously the right time. And here, just examples of, I think this is a pointer, does it work? Oh, okay, no. Right, so here just a description of the real, or visualization of the real potential that we have today in Africa, where an estimation, it's extremely difficult to judge, but it's an estimation of about 20 kilograms per hectare that is being used in Africa. And remember the size, what we talked about, of all these together, plus more. In India, EU and US, below 200 kilograms per hectare, and China that is reaching 273 or plus, but we obviously heard from Roberto earlier about their policies of the use of fertilizers, so we expect this to potentially drop slightly for the future. So the potential remains for Africa, and its growth will be clearly vertical and horizontal. So vertical is by consuming more fertilizer in terms of the existing land, and horizontal and vertical by using more land to apply fertilizers. Now, this is a work in progress, but because of the opportunity came to present at the AFA conference, we thought we'd bring you this concept that we are working on, which we call the African iceberg. And this is really a simple picture, and we're trying to work with some academics to try and develop different issues with this iceberg in Africa, is all the issues that are visible and not visible in Africa that needs to be addressed in order to solve these problems, but we'll keep hearing about it so that Africa becomes the solution. So, and the choice of an iceberg is the darker green is what's been visible. So this is how to read this. So it's the visible challenges, and the higher we go, it's the more addressable are these challenges today around Africa, both from the public and the private sector. The other side, the lighter green, is the further we go is more increasing challenges, and obviously there are deep-rooted problems that exist that are hindering any potential growth in Africa. Now, this is not all, and of course this is not completed with all the elements, we're working on that, but the interesting about this, it's not simply the fact it's an iceberg, the fact that it visualizes very, very well the elements that are hiding, but also a lot of these elements are completely interconnected, which means you probably are addressing a training in Nigeria of the different farmers in Nigeria, but if you're not addressing a CFR price or a freight cost, or maybe deep down to ghost farming level, and that's particularly happening in examples in West Africa for the subsidies, then you are not really solving the problem. And therefore, it's a complex, interconnected network of the different problems in a very, very opaque market. And that's why we added also transparency, because I would say up to before AFRICOM came up, yes, Africa was reported on publication, mainly a lot about the production in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Egypt, South Africa, but very little and very limited information on what's happening in the real Africa. And that's not just in terms of trades, but also prices, who's buying, why, the policies, regulations, and so on. And you will see in the next example some projection of how these problems come into play and this into allowing a consumption of fertilizers in Africa. Mali is a very good example. It's driven strongly, so the consumption is around 550,000 tons, can go to 600, 700 depending on seasons, depending on products that are used and prices. But the main driver in Mali is the CMDT. CMDT is a cotton producer, and they buy yearly, well, at least in 2019, 300,000 ton of urea and NPKs, and it's been growing rather rapidly for the cotton industry. You can see here, this is the different volumes per NPK grade and urea for each different state for that particular demand. Now, when that tender was awarded, you can see the award price here. Apologize, I haven't got it in dollar per ton, but you can see the increase exceeded $500 per ton for urea in this case. When you work out exactly this distributor who won this award, how much it cost him to, at the end, at Abidjan CFR, because Mali is a landlocked country, and to get all this urea and this NPKs, they have to come through Côte d'Ivoire and the port of Abidjan, then it comes at $289 per ton. The day that results came out, the urea market for West Africa, this is prilled urea by the way, it's $262 per ton CFR. So that's even before we go into any other margins, there is already $30, around $30 in the CFR cost, and in so much money that is driven the end cost to the farmers to be much higher. Remember, these are amongst the poorest farmers in the world, ending up with these high prices, the highest prices in the world of fertilizer. And as you can see, these levels, and I'm happy to discuss more details on each element, because if you take examples of China, when the potash arrive, or other markets in Southeast Asia, you can see the inland transportation, financing, discharging, bagging, potentially import tax, and all these elements will be much, much smaller in other countries. And that's why I explained about these interconnected elements in this African iceberg that are all pushing at the end. So at the end, this farmer, what is he going to do when he's having huge prices to pay, knowing that it's an impact also, the difficulty once he goes and this gets even more complicated, the weather, depending on rain, and if he doesn't get a very good yield, the next year probably he will skip using fertilizer. So it's extremely complicated challenges. This is the same thing, so I put it an example for the 14-18 SB, prices of NPKs for that particular tender, and you can see almost similar structure. The landing cost net back from Mali to CFR, to Abidjan CFR is about $328 per ton, for your information. And therefore, taking back the African iceberg, just picking up these elements, and I'm sure we can take it even further, how complicated and interconnected this, particularly in the less addressed part of the iceberg. Good. So we will move swiftly to the changing dynamics. Here is a selection of different countries of where there are different things are happening. I must apologize for the Egypt and for our brothers in Egypt and sisters in Egypt for the map. I've been told there is a slight mistake in the map from our publication, so we will sort that out. But this is examples of where changing dynamics. In Morocco, there was a switch from compound to bulk. Compound, Morocco is one of the largest producers of phosphates in the world, of all its forms, yet it was importing NPK. But they very soon realized that we will change. They were importing European NPKs, but now they are actually exporting NPKs everywhere. Production of compound NPKs that allowed them to do that. And in nitrogen imports, you can see that it's a net nitrogen importer, typically bringing Russian and Turkish ammonium nitrate and urea to Morocco. The market can go between 300,000 and 400,000 ton imports. This is a major one. We'll go into details. Phosphate, urea, and a new supply to the region. There was the announcement of a phosphate and nitrogen complex by OCP with Ghana, with the Ghanaian government. Remains questions about it because of the cost of gas. It's an offshore fields to have access to that gas, but most importantly, you've got just huge new capacity, up to 3 million ton just by Dangote, on top of Notori and Indorama in Nigeria, which will bring the question, is it viable now or maybe in a few years' time, depending on what Nigeria going to do, knowing that Nigeria has a very, very low-cost gas. We have changing dynamics in South Africa, Iranian cargoes, what are suspected to be Iranian cargoes, that have been changed the dynamic there in terms of costs and obviously in terms of market share. This is an important one, prill and granular. It's not happening yet. It's happening in the West, but in the East, particularly Kenya and Tanzania, they need prilled urea, nothing else. And that, in a way, it's stopping them from benefiting from the ample supply that there is in the granular in the region. Phosphates, we see OCP back into Kenya, which creates a new dynamic in the Kenyan market. Ethiopia, there is obviously a new urea and nitrogen complex planned there by OCP, but also there are blending plants, and that will completely change this largest tender in Africa for urea and NPKs that is ongoing right now. And of course, last but not least, is the new Sokhna's phosphate project, which is impressive to see shipments go into Europe, go into Sudan, number of moving dynamics in this region. Extremely active, and we didn't even know 5% of all this before we started going into this. A zoom on Senegal. To anybody, this just looks, it's simple, it's nice. Senegal imported 25,000 tons of urea, 3,000 tons of DAP from the Saudis, and yeah, granular urea from Nigeria. But actually, all these three elements, trades, are extremely important and changing the dynamic of the West African market. We'll start with least change, but a big potential with the new capacities coming in. Indorama. Indorama has owns the phosphate ICS and complex in Senegal, and therefore has its distribution. A region that is used to prill, but because you have your own distribution and access to these to this platform, they are pushing their own granular, which is changing the market from traditionally prilled into completely granular and hoping competitivity. There is also another element which is we're still tracking. There is a potential cargo coming from Iran of urea to Senegal with an ETA of today, actually. So I need to go and check that. The other elements are, staying on urea, is Fertiglobe. Fertiglobe, the JV of ADNOC and FCI, very impressive portfolio on the eastern side and potentially in the south. But they've just marked this month their first cargo into Senegal, obviously showing their interest and determination to go excuse me, into the whole of the continent. But it highlights the interest of even new guys to go into that market because they don't want to miss the growth. And it's a market that can be very loyal, that once you have that relationship with this buyer, they will continue to buy from you. Last but not least, again, is the phosphate market. The western side, understandably, it was a large presence from the Moroccan producer, OCP, for many reasons. A big strategy for South-South, an African strategy, but also logistical advantage. Only, it's not just OCP. We also have a lot of Russian product that's coming into West Africa, particularly this year from Fosagro, for example. But now the Saudi producer Ma'adin has registered their first sale, again, showing how the market is, all the producers are in need of developing other available markets. I'll go quickly. I cannot blame myself for being late. This is the Kenyan market. Really just trying to give you a zoom of how we look at the markets and what we know. This is the NPK's growth for the largest consumer of NPKs in Kenya is the KTDA, which is the Kenyan Tea Authority. And you can see the growth. We can talk more in details in terms of year to year. This is the year to year growth. And on the right side, you can see to be part of the change in dynamics, you can see in 2019, it's missing one cargo in December, but you can see the suppliers' market share there with Fosagro and the Saudis, SABIC and Ma'adin. This year, we expect that completely to change. Is Fosagro going to stay there? Morocco's already back. They've already shipped an 8,000 ton cargo, but now they've got another 15,000 ton. So there is a shift in dynamic ongoing all the time. There are other elements that are going on about the cadmium regulation, which being now increased, which allow a number of producers to be able to place their product there. This is the market share of the importers within Kenya. So only about 4 of them, I think, are about 78%. So clearly limited market. So once you have access to that buyer, then you are done. I think you all know Morocco very well, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. This is latest information for the last 6 months up to February, and you can see the different products and the different region. This is just to highlight on the global footprint and the diversification, which allows the producer to really manage their operations. And when a market goes off season, another market goes on season. When a product is has a netback lower than the other, you can always switch for the highest premium or the highest market in demand. So an extremely strong strategy. Nigeria. So Nigeria is another change in dynamic. Happened quite in the past, back in 2014 when it was a major importer of nitrogen, to change completely to almost a net exporter, but definitely by 2017, where there was the unit from Indorama for granular urea. And you can see they're exporting around 700, 800,000 ton. 2020, we expect that to explode because 3 million ton of new urea capacity is about to be commissioned. We expect 1.4 million to start turning around May, so very soon, and therefore that will be a huge change into the West Africa in terms of exports, but also they will go with 3 million ton, they will go to Brazil, they will go to the US, and therefore also provide competition to other urea producers. Month by month, exports of Nigeria, I don't think even the statistic have that because the customs go back to 3 months, but you can see the seasonality and the explosion of exports, and you will expect more. Now, last year, around 500,000 went to Brazil, USA, and India, with the rest being around Africa. But obviously we have huge capacity coming, clearly a major change in dynamic in the market. South Africa, I will skip this. If anybody wants to talk, we can discuss later. These are different regulatory implications on the market. We will focus on Nigeria because it made a huge impact on the NPK imports into Nigeria, and I will explain the story. So this is the PFI system. This is the Presidential Fertilizer Initiative that the President Buhari introduced. They were importing about 600,000 ton of NPKs, compound NPKs, Russian way in the past, and recently mainly Moroccan product. But it was too expensive. He wanted to support and revive the industry. There was huge capacity in blending, you will see later. Then they introduced this PFI system where they have good offtake agreement with DAP and MOP. They have local urea production, and then they can revive all NPK production in Nigeria. The only problem, the Nigerians didn't follow because the farmers were used to that compound NPK, and they didn't like the blended product, especially. Remember, one of the issue in the iceberg was the adulteration. It wasn't real triple 15 or 20-10-10. It was product with sand. Really, they were completely and were willing to pay up to $100 more to go for the compound. So this is the PFI, how it works. Quite a complex system, but it's simple in a way that blending in Nigeria, products coming from OCP for the DAP. Last year was BPC, this year is Oral Kali. And you can see the fertilizer consumption in Nigeria and the pricing of urea within each state in Nigeria. But this is the interesting thing. So the regulation came up, and the farmers continued to do it. So what the government did, introduced a ban. That was the stock that was happening towards the end of 2018, around 500,000 ton. A ban stopped, so they were just depleting their stock. There was no import. Zero grain came from of NPKs into Nigeria. The story continues. You'll have the slide to go all through the details. There were presidential. There were people trying to get imports. The ban has just been reinstated, well, rather reaffirmed, on the 30th of January, and the market completely stopped importing. And the reason is they are trying to promote local production, and you can see this is the location of the different blenders, NPK blenders in Nigeria. In red, the blender sign with the number is the number of blenders in each state. And clearly here we have a forecast for the NPK consumption, different scenarios depending on these regulations and so on. So, to conclude, there's something that that is also very interesting. We keep talking about, and I hear it all the time, sub-Saharan Africa, Northern Africa. It's actually one continent. It's Africa, and we're not going to go through the reasons why we have this in our mind and where did it start from. But it's actually one Africa. So much appreciated if you also agree to try and use that anytime you can. Africa is the solution. Clearly, we just need to address a very complicated African iceberg. Changing dynamics, a very, very live market, growing, but clearly changing, and need to be informed, need to be active, and certainly need to be agile, without forgetting the regulatory impact to watch. This is what we do. I'm not going to go through that. I'm happy to talk to anybody. And shukran lakum, and thank you very much. So, now, if there are any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mounir. I have a question and a comment. The question regarding North Africa. Where is the North Africa from your representation? You ignore many North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria. She is the largest producer for nitrogen fertilizer, phosphate fertilizer, and others. My comment also regarding the map of Egypt. Map of Egypt is not right.
Correct. Yeah.
So please correct it.
Yes.
Thank you.
So thank you for your comment. I mentioned the map of Egypt. I've been told in the beginning, so this will be done, especially it's a publication that goes everywhere. On the comments on North Africa, this was purely selection of the consumer markets in terms of imports. Clearly, in terms of production, there is a huge concentration in the north side of the continent, as well as footprint around Europe, USA, everywhere. With the time we had, we couldn't go through every single thing, but it's of course it's very, very much noted. Maybe last one.
Thank you for your presentation. My comment is that Africa production is promising regarding fertilizer production, but I think this is not reflected on fertilizer application rate for farmers. It is very low, 20 kilo per hectare. Yes. Why is that?
It's the multi-billion-dollar question, and I think it's I've heard it. And I think hopefully one of the answers will be to that. I've heard it in one of the presentation yesterday for one of the producers in the Middle East. They try, no, in fact, it was a presentation of the Ittihad, of the AFA, that would be more focused on the farmers to actually, in the region, to be using more of the production, because the majority of this production in the region is exported. Same thing for Africa. Morocco exports 9 million or 10 million tons of rock, 8 to 10 million tons of DAP, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. Africa has major problem in terms of the interconnected issues that are everywhere, and that's a historical thing. One needs a public-private sector. I need to have a long-term strategy, working with government not to change their regulations, because the regulations changes all the time. Farmers cannot access the fertilizer they need. Sometimes they're forced to buy a certain grade that they don't need, or they don't even know that that's what they need. So there is the training. There is a complex structure that puts Africa at 20. In 2006, the governments of African governments declared the Abuja Declaration to go into 50 kilograms per hectare by 2015. We are 20 and we are 2020. So now the Abuja 2 is ongoing, so to come up with a new realistic target. I think there's a lot of work needs to be done together, from the transparency, what we bring, the producers, the private sector investment, the government, to really work together. One by one, it will take longer to achieve than trying to do it in together. Okay, for reason of time, we will move to our next speaker. So we will have Mrs. Darina Pisharskaya, Global Fertilizer Market Analyst at Chemical Gain.